Where does money really come from? Out of a printing press? That seems a little phony to me. How can paper out of a printing press have any real value? Okay, then where does value come from? Out of a factory? Off of a farm? Yeah, as a matter of fact. So, how do we reconcile all of this with factories that produce a lot of goods that we need and use? Where's the money come from to build that factory? Whose money is it? Who should benefit from that factory? Well, that's some of the questions imposed by socialism, communism, capitalism, and oh, don't forget, free markets. So, Tim and I discussed some of that coming up.
In the movie, immediately think of is
Night Shift, or what was it? It was Goldie Hawn and
no, well that's fine too. Yeah, but prior to that, this is right after World War II. Oh, it's just a beautiful, beautiful movie. Oh, come on, help me out here. I hate to do that when I bring it up, and then I can't say. But if Jan was here, she would tell me because she loves it too. But the guy with hooks, did you see that movie?
the guy with hooks.
The,
No,
the actual one that came
his
back from
hands were hooks.
yeah.
Okay.
For real, this was a real guy. But anyway, but because it's after the war and everybody's trying to readjust, and it gets into all of what you just mentioned, and men coming back from war and what are they supposed to do for a living? The women aren't sure they want to give up their jobs. Uh, yeah, I wish I could think of that name. Oh,
Oh, I would like to see that film.
it's
Well, I know from the experience of my mother worked in for Lear Avia for Bill Lear, the guy that created the Learjet.
mhm,
And in Piqua, Ohio, she assembled radios for airplanes.
mhm.
And my dad was in Iran building airplanes for the Russian Air Force as to go into Eastern Europe and to fight the Battle of Stalingrad. And he was putting the radios in those airplanes that my mom had built
Mhm.
and building those airplanes for the Soviet Air Force, which was an interesting. He was there for 3 years doing that, and my mom, throughout the entire war, was working at that plant building those radios.
Yeah, and I do have the thought, people have brought this up, and it's a little beyond my pay grade, I guess, but yeah, okay, we got a thriving economy, but everybody's at work building all this stuff that's going over to Europe, so it's not doing us any good. Um, it's not creating more food. It's not creating more tires. You know, there was a tire shortage, a
It does
rubber
create
shortage.
wages.
So, but you can't buy anything. So
Yeah,
they had rationing.
right. You
So
did
it's,
have
you
rationing
know,
because of the war.
so it's just say an interesting conundrum that everybody had a job and there wasn't much there you could buy, or not
Yeah.
enough that you could
Well, it
buy.
increased savings too.
For sure.
It
Yep.
created the
Yep.
possibility of
Yep.
savings,
Yep.
which helped to funnel the post-war housing boom. But the GI Bill did that as well,
Oh yeah.
which was an
Yeah.
amazing benefit.
Yeah.
Free education and low cost housing,
Yeah.
which again was a bottom up kind of approach to.
And it needed to happen because somebody was smart enough. I guess maybe it was Marshall. At least it was the Marshall Plan. Uh, that all of a sudden you have all this productivity of the United States going towards making tanks and planes, and almost like somebody snapped their fingers. Okay, stop it. Well, you don't want that production to stop, that productivity to stop. You just don't want to stop making tanks and
You
planes.
want to transition to other
And
products.
all these GIs, all these soldiers are coming back looking for jobs. You don't want that to cave in on you. So they
Hmm.
said, let's send as many men as possible to college, not into a factory because there's no jobs there. There's too many people already.
Yeah,
Let's build homes because we need homes. So I think it was a
that college stuff then fueled a whole generation of educated workforce and a technical workforce that allowed the next phase of the industrial revolution to take place with the growth of computerization. And that wouldn't have happened. My uncle was got the GI Bill.
Mhm.
He ended up becoming a chemical engineer. He invented the soft dashboard for automobiles for
yeah,
General Motors
yeah, yeah.
with the chemical engineering degree, and then he ended up with the job in Silicon Valley and working for a Silicon Valley company, and it all because of the GI Bill. It was a pretty remarkable thing.
Yeah, yeah.
But there were the problem with war production for any economy is that there is no reuse value for war material. once a tank is built, it's got one purpose
Mhm.
and it can't be repurposed very easily. Whereas you build an automobile, it has a recycled life of 2 or 3 times down the road to create more economic activity and
Mhm.
more
Yeah,
exchange.
yeah.
So a war economy is a
It's a
is a hard
it's its own entity. Yeah.
yeah, it's a hard thing. It can be a shot in the arm for the industry at that point and for employment,
Mhm.
but it doesn't create the use value post production, the reuse value of it. And so it doesn't cycle through the economy like any other product would. That's a durable product.
Yeah.
Like steel can be recycled. An automobile can ultimately be recycled, but it passes through 2 or 3 hands before that. And so there's some residual value that's created. That was the problem of the 1980s war buildup and military buildup, because that weaponry then just sat. It didn't have a residual value beyond its initial production.
Right.
And that's the problem that NATO is faced when they're pressured to devote more than 2% of their GDP to building a military so that they can protect themselves from Russian expansion. It it's a real drain on their economy because it takes away other things from their
Well, sure.
economy.
Guns and butter.
Yeah, and it's understandable why Europe has resisted that. There was also the proscription against Germany having a standing army for a
Mhm.
long time after World War II. So they got contradictory messages there, and it made it difficult. But it's it's one of the problems of production there that's going to lead to some catastrophic things for Europe if they end up
Yeah.
having to devote 5% of their GDP toward military
Yeah,
production.
but then again, it would seem reasonable if they have to devote as much GDP as we do, and they don't.
We don't do any more than 2% of
We do, don't
of
we?
our GDP for the military. Yeah, the numbers I've seen is
Yeah.
that we're at 2% or slightly below for military hardware,
Okay.
and it's
Well, is it just military hardware? Is that 2%
well, I mean,
also the actual military, the soldiers?
so we're talking GDP, not budget, because
Yeah.
as the budget, it's a huge.
Well, but yeah, budget is whatever you want it to be, but
But if
yeah,
it's GDP, it's a smaller percentage than what Europe is putting into its military production at this point. Poland, because of their proximity to Russia, has devoted almost 4% of its GDP toward military production and
mhm,
preparedness, but it's bankrupting them. It's really costing them a dear amount, and that's a huge number. And because it's not just 4% of their GDP, it's like more than 50% of their operating budget for their government. And that's a huge amount
sure.
to devote to that. And when you've got a country like Poland that's coming out of a huge economic slump because of its dictatorship that they just overcome, but also still trying to come out of its phase of being a satellite of the Soviet
Mhm,
Union,
mhm.
which was an economic drain on them. So they're faced with some serious. There are
Yeah,
existential
yeah,
issues for them because they may not exist if they don't do that.
yeah. And just to throw a monkey wrench in, I keep thinking to myself, the world is more productive than it has ever been. Why do we feel like we're in trouble, you know?
Uh, well, the world is, and it's interesting about productivity in the United States. The American workforce is among the most productive workforces in the world,
Mhm.
and but we're not told that, and we're not rewarded in the same as though we are. And
Well,
and it's it's an amazing thing if you look at the comparison of relationship between CEO compensation and workforce compensation.
mhm,
It is terribly skewed, and the real wages of the
mhm.
American working class have remained relatively flat since the
For sure,
1970s.
for sure. I'll just again call me devil's advocate because I'm less worried about the money disparity because it isn't real money. Again, if Musk builds a factory or business, it's on just the factory, and it's worth $50 billion. Okay. Well, that doesn't mean there's $50 billion lying around someplace. You know, you don't lift up the rug in the office and there's $50 billion. It doesn't exist. It's the value is there. So it
He's got
must,
a lot of that on paper for sure,
yeah.
in the
So,
form of
so I'm
stock.
less worried about, oh, Musk is worth this much as far as that really makes any difference. It makes a difference, but I don't think it's that essential. It comes down to how much are we producing? How much can we afford to buy? And I don't think how much Musk is worth makes any real difference to any of it. You can't take his money and distribute it among us because it's not real money. It's not there. So you can't do that. Um, I'm not saying there aren't things that need to be tweaked and fixed and so forth, but I don't think you can simply say this, oh, look at this disparity in CEO income compared to the guy who sweeps the floors. Therefore, that's wrong, or that even makes that much difference. Um, and again, if you take that CEO's compensation and distribute it more, so the people in the bottom have more, I'm fine with that in theory. But if you're not producing more, all you're doing is creating inflation. If the janitor now has 10% more salary and everybody else does too, never mind how he got that 10%. It came from the CEO, it came from the printing press. If you don't have 10% more production, all you've done is just raise the price of everything 10% because that money is going to get absorbed into the
Yeah,
same goods.
but they're going to take that money and buy essentials. They're going,
Only if they exist.
yeah, but they create a demand so that those essentials can exist.
I'm not so sure. It depends. I mean, it's all in so many moving parts, you can't pin anything down for sure. But if a factory, if the owners of a business have a factory and they're watching markets all the time, they're watching their competitors, they're watching everything. And they say, we see an increase in demand coming for our widgets. They're going to find a way to make more widgets. But if they don't see an increase in demand coming, why would they?
Hmm.
Uh, if you give everybody a raise of 10%, now these factory owners have to decide, is that 10% more buying power or is that 10% that we can just jack up the prices and not create
Hmm.
more goods? And again, nobody's got the businessmen don't have the answer to that. They're wrestling with it constantly,
Hmm.
churning things
Well,
around and
the
trying to
studies
figure
that took place with the raising of the minimum wage in California
it.
to over $15 an hour, they found that it did not have a negative impact on production or the cost. Uh, there there was a there was a growth in demand, and they were able to meet that demand, but it did not mean an inflationary cost of the goods that those workers were producing. And particularly, they followed the price of fast food based on the fact that the workforce was getting paid more than $15 an hour.
Mhm.
It did not increase to the same percentage level,
Well, sure.
and and that was not a drain on.
Yeah.
It was not an
But
inflationary pressure.
but think about fast food. What is the point of fast food? Point of it is to manufacture food
Hmm.
as efficiently as possible, as opposed to going to a restaurant, sit down, sit there
Yep.
and dine, which is about the most expensive way to get food that there is. Well,
Yep.
that's what fast food tries to not do, is make the
Hmm.
food as inexpensive as possible. Um, and I had a point here, but uh,
It's easy to lose.
yeah, but so you give the workers a raise, the fast food people have to say, okay, how can we make the food with less labor?
Hmm.
Which we've been doing all along. I mean, that's not some big revelation. They've all along. They've got, I don't know. I never did work at a fast food restaurant. I don't know how I escaped that, but they're flipping these burgers in this machine that just grills them and comes back out. It's all done, and less and
Hmm.
less hand labor to make
Hmm.
the food cheaper.
Hmm.
Um, so that's not a way to create jobs in that respect. So
Yeah, but it does open up the possibility of creating jobs and other unforeseen economic
well,
activity in the future. And yeah, obviously we're not going to solve it at this point, but those are the dynamics that are at work.
oh, they're all at work all the time. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but What else can we talk about? What kind of history stuff?
Um, well, I still did, and we certainly brushed against it, but uh, we talked about the Industrial Revolution, and what I'm kind of getting at is prior to the Industrial Revolution, so we're somewhere in the 1700s, jobs didn't exist in the way we think of them now. To some extent, yes, but the
Hmm.
middle class barely existed. Um, you would almost say there was no such thing as a working class, which is stretching it. But the peasants, they didn't go to a factory and work. Peasants worked their plot of land and they ate what they
Hmm.
grew and gave half of their corn to the king or whatever. And they ate their own eggs and so forth. So you'd almost say there's no economy in that sense. If you grow your own food and eat it, is there an economy there anywhere? Not really. And that's the way it was. So you have the Industrial Revolution. It starts being a case where people are actually leaving home, going someplace to go to work, get paid a set amount of money, take that set amount of money and go buy their food or whatever. And that's our idea of a job now, and it didn't even exist before that.
Hmm.
And so and we touched on this, but I'd like to touch on it some more. So in that regard, slavery doesn't seem that unusual
Hmm.
because okay, the slaves don't get paid. Well, if you work in your plot of land as a peasant, you're still not getting paid. It's not that different. Uh,
Well,
when you
it's different
start,
in the
when you
sense that you own your
oh,
own
I'm not
labor.
saying
Yeah.
to say anything good about slavery, but just it's to look at it for the people looking at it at the time, it doesn't look that different. And the peasant didn't own his own land typically. He was sharecropping with the king. Um, but people started having jobs, and I think that's when your mind can start thinking, I have a job, that slave has a job. I get paid, that slave doesn't get paid. Then you see the difference.
Hmm.
I'm getting money, he's not.
Yeah.
My grandfather didn't get money either because he was a peasant working a plot of land.
Hmm.
But now I
But
get
they
money.
would market their surplus, and so they could get money.
Well,
So that,
sure, sure.
and
But
then that also led to the surplus. Whenever you create a surplus in the society, if you produce more than you need,
mm,
like a farmer often does,
mm,
um, you can sell that surplus. Then you can buy other goods and services from other people, and that gives rise to the
yeah,
craft industry
yeah, yeah.
and craftsmen who were making furniture or making shoes or making wheels for wagons, which becomes the beginning stages of an early pre-industrial
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
situation. What drives the industrial revolution is massive amounts of surplus. And the massive
Um,
amounts of surplus required to build a factory, the capital that's needed to do that, is gained partly through slavery. It's in the South. It is the surplus that enslaved people created for the South actually built the Industrial Revolution of the Northeast. There's a really good book that the Stowe House sells. It's called "The Half Has Never Been Told"
okay.
by Edward Baptist, a historian, economic historian, who goes through and charts how the surplus that's created, and this is what Marx would have called primitive accumulation, and a lot of economists still use that term, primitive accumulation, and that's through very gross levels of exploitation, whether it's imbalance of trade that England engages in India and the plunder of India and the plunder of Africa. Those proceeds create the capital that build the massive amounts of capital that are needed to build the machinery of the Industrial Revolution. And so that surplus, slavery is a huge contributor to that surplus, and there were investors from England who invested in plantations in the South. There
Yeah, I
were,
see a lot of connection between
yeah,
the estates of England and the plantations of the South. Very
right.
similar.
And
Yeah,
the
yeah.
Northeastern business people invest in the South. There's all kinds of money being made over insuring ships coming across
Mhm,
with human cargo.
mhm.
That's
Or
where,
any cargo for that
yeah,
matter.
the
Yeah,
insurance companies were driving a lot of the capital formation for because they were investing then in turn for these big industrial apparatuses,
Mhm.
primarily the textile industry,
Mhm.
but also steel mills and other
Mhm.
things like that.
Mhm.
So that accumulation was needed. The other thing that was needed was a surplus of labor. And
Mhm.
one of the things that happened in England and was a little more difficult in the United States because we always had this westward expansion to if there was surplus of labor, that surplus of labor could move west
Mhm.
and possibly find land and do subsistence. But in England, the enclosure movement drives people off the land, forces them into the cities, so they become the surplus labor that gets absorbed by the Industrial Revolution. But that enclosure movement took away family farms and all that, leaving big estates that the aristocracy had, the British nobility, and it took away the notion of the commons. And
Uh,
the commons is where there would be a plot of land where everybody could graze their sheep
right.
or their
Boston
cattle.
Commons up in Boston. Yeah.
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 And so the commons in England disappear. They get fenced in. And it goes hand in glove then with advances in agricultural machinery.
Mhm.
Then you get this guy Jethro Tull who invents the cornrow planter, and he that makes it possible for a large landowner to plant a lot more
Sure.
grain
Sure.
without labor.
Sure.
That labor gets surplus to the cities. They're
Mhm.
forced into the cities. They become the Oliver Twist
Okay. Well,
scenario.
let's pause there a moment because again, I need to have my knowledge enhanced. We were talking about the peasants and they have their plot of land. And in my mind, it largely came down to, okay, the king and I don't know how it all works. King grants land to the next thing under a king, whoever that is, and they grant estates to the people under them, and then those people grant plots of land to the peasants.
Mhm.
I don't, in my mind, in England, see the lower class owning a whole lot of their own land ever. Am I wrong?
Some did, but they lose it through debt. Debt that's incurred
Okay.
from making the risk to get seed for the next year's planting, things like that. Um, Land consolidation occurs during this enclosure movement. There are obviously large estates that are
Yeah.
controlled by the
Yeah, but see, that's
aristocracy
that's
of
what is in
England.
my head. Maybe I've watched too much Downton Abbey, but I've always had in my head that the people at the bottom never owned their own land in England. Might be somewhere back then they did,
Yeah,
but
and that accumulation occurs, but there were people that did own land,
okay.
just like there were people in Germany that owned land.
Mhm.
What happened? The the Catholic Church under the feudal system were the collectors of the what was it called, the tribute, and
Mhm.
then that worked its way up to the Holy Roman Emperor and the Pope, and so it was intimately tied to the church. So the local parish priest became the enforcer, and
Mhm.
the what the Protestant Reformation did was broke apart that Catholic Church system and replaced it with these princely kingdoms, and then lords underneath the princely kingdoms who gradually accumulated land and had people work on those lands.
Yeah, but I'm still seeing. I get the accumulating land because first you had city states because that's about all one governmental entity could handle was a
Hmm.
city state, and gradually, for various reasons, nations could be bigger and actually be controlled. And I still don't see where the peasants own their own land anyway.
Yeah, some did, and it wasn't a huge number. But there's a great historian, Carlo Cipolla. He's part of this school of historic thought that he writes history without names, and he describes he and another man by the name of Braudel. They wrote about he looks at the Cipolla looks at he has a book called Clocks and Culture, and how clocks built culture. But the clock was a product of the windmill. And they begin to use the gearing and stuff that was used in a windmill or a water wheel that was driving a factory to create a clock that told time. And culture was built around this in the town square with a clock. And it was just really fascinating stuff. never mentions anybody's names. He just
Mhm.
talks about how things developed. And Braudel did the same thing. When did people start using tableware instead of their hands to eat? When did they eat out of bowls? When did porcelain come into being? All this kind of stuff. And looking at material life to try to explain what happened. And the reason they decided not to use anybody's name is that they did not want to confuse. They didn't want to get wrapped up in those personalities.
Right.
They
Right.
just wanted to focus on what happened in material life.
Yeah, no, I like that because there's certainly some very important names, but I often think, okay, suppose Gutenberg didn't invent the printing press, somebody would have.
Right.
Is
Somebody
it
would have.
really that significant? The Gutenberg, Christopher Columbus. I think he's almost irrelevant when you get down to it. Somebody was going to do what he did.
Yeah.
Somebody from
He
Europe
just
was,
happened to be there at the
yeah,
right
he
time.
was the guy that did it,
Yeah.
and gets the credit, so to speak. But it's
Yeah.
irrelevant almost that Columbus discovered America. It was going
Right.
to happen.
Well, Chipley has another book called Guns, Sales, and Empire. And he looks at the material production of weaponry and technology involved in building of ships and sails and the changes and all of that and how it enabled the building of empire, which is a fascinating. And all of his books are just real short, like
Okay.
130, 120 page books that are just gems for describing how all this took place. And it's a great contribution because it, we're not distracted by the names
Mhm.
as a result of that,
Mhm.
because it's so easy to build these mythologies around someone's
Yeah.
name and their presence and their charisma as a person. So, but that stuff is yeah, nameless history is pretty interesting stuff. Now, what happened in the United States? In the Northeast, the consolidation to bring a workforce to the urban areas, say in Massachusetts, um, it was often young girls
Yeah.
that worked in those textile
Well,
factories in Lowell,
but the
Massachusetts.
husband and son still had to work the fields, but
Right.
yeah.
And the girls were sent off to these factories
Mhm.
because the farmers were just barely making it,
Sure.
and they needed these girls to bring in extra income.
Yeah.
And so they
And
gathered them
children,
in
and
Lowell,
children.
and yeah, they were teenagers, and some of them 12 years old and older.
Mhm.
But that became the initial workforce for the textile revolution. But all of that was dependent on getting the cheaper cotton because of
Mhm.
enslaved labor making the cheaper cotton.
Well,
Or
obviously you want cheaper cotton, but I still think to myself, cotton could have been incredibly expensive you still would have had the textile revolution because now instead of sitting at home and doing this with a shuttle back and forth and taking all
yeah,
day to weave a yard of cloth, you could do, and there's another name I can't think of, but there's a woman who wrote a great book. She's English, two great books about how people flipped from subsisting in their home to having a job and buying
hmm
stuff. And for instance, weaving your own cloth as opposed to buying the cloth. Well, weaving a yard of cloth might take all day. It got to the point where you could do 15 minutes worth of labor or something and go buy a yard of cloth. And all of these things that went that way, furniture and so forth.
hmm
Um,
But they still, to build those factories, they still needed large sums of capital,
oh, for sure. Yeah.
and that initial money comes from the South and the surplus that's created from enslaved labor.
You're saying the capital came from the South to build northern factories?
Yes, there was a
Okay.
huge relationship between them. And some of the richest people in America prior to the Civil War lived in South Carolina and were plantation owners. And so that capital, they invested,
Mhm.
and so there was an interrelationship between northern industry and agricultural large plantations, because those plantations are huge.
Oh, yeah.
And it it's amazing how much surplus is created by that, because you're paying very, you have upkeep of your labor, but many people didn't. labor was, you didn't have to pay that much to maintain them compared to paying a wage.
Mhm.
And it's interesting that John C. Calhoun, who was the senator from South Carolina, who the pro-slavery senator from South Carolina, he considered himself a Marxist, and he looked at the industrial system of the North, and he claimed um, that the amount of alienation and exploitation that occurred in the textile mills in Lowell, Massachusetts, were worse than the exploitation on his plantation.
Yeah. Now,
And
it might be the case. The question is, on his plantation, the slave has no choice. In Lowell, Massachusetts, they
there
have a
is a
choice.
choice,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
But I mean, that was Richard Hofstadter has a collection of articles, and he calls John C. Calhoun the marks of the master class, which is it's a very interesting article. And and it's based on the fact that he understood surplus value and how surplus value is what drives and builds an economy.
Mhm.
And whoever can accumulate the most surplus value in the fastest amount of time is going to end up on top.
Well, certainly when an industry develops, all the race to develop the steel industry and uh, Carnegie, if I got the right
Yeah.
guy,
And Frick, yep.
it came out on top, but so many people were in there trying to be the top guy and trying to buy each other out and break each other, and yeah, and then railroads, you name it, yeah. So
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting how government gets leveraged in this to build wealth because Jay Gould, who was the big railroad builder, and Cornelius Vanderbilt, who was a railroad builder, Jay Gould managed to get the government to finance all of the railroads he built
yeah,
from St. Louis to the West Coast because he was given all these land grants. And then he was able to sell the land, and he was given a mile north and a mile south of wherever his railroad would go. And so he was the original deed owner for thousands of miles. And then he would plot out towns every 8 miles and then sell property a mile away, up to a mile away from where the railroad was. And so he never ran the railroad at all himself. He made all of his money by building it and then turned it over to somebody else to run. And that was how the Union Pacific got started and a number of other railroads out
mhm,
there. It was all through those land grants that were turned into wealth
yeah.
by people like him. But there's a great that John Kenneth Galbraith had this book in a PBS series called The Age of Excess, looking at the Gilded Age and what happened. And Cornelius Vanderbilt tried to buy up Jay Gould's East Coast railroad business. And what Gould did was he kept printing stock, more and more stock. He created an inflation of stock. And Vanderbilt kept buying it and kept buying it, but he could never get a controlling interest because Gould kept producing more stock. And it was
Didn't Vanderbilt catch on at some point?
ultimately he did, but it was, he was driven by his greed at that point. And, but it's a fascinating story of how they screwed over each other. And Vanderbilt makes um, his initial money by buying carbines from the army that were malfunctioning. And he didn't do anything to them. He resold them to the Union Army, still non-functioning. But he got these surplus weapons from the Union Army and then just recycled them, saying that they were fixed and they weren't. And he didn't put any money into it. He just bought them at a real low price because they were non-functioning, and then resold them at the regular price back to the Army and sent them off to war with that. And so he made a tremendous amount of money off of being able to scam the government to do that. And that's when he used his surplus that he created with that to start building railroads like the New York Central Railroad. And yeah, there's so many things like that worked during the Gilded Age because there was absolutely no regulation on anything. It was just like it was a wild west of enterprise and a totally unfettered market. And that's what those kinds of excesses are what led to the progressive era reforms. But even the progressive era reforms um, ended up being playing into the hands of the well-established industrialists because they started building regulations that they knew upstart companies could not
Yeah. Yeah.
match.
Yeah.
That a restroom had to be so many feet from a water fountain or whatever, or a water supply and things like that, that were only specified to work with their factories. And then it was applied to everybody. So the upstart factories couldn't match them and couldn't compete with them.
Yeah, I couldn't say with any expertise, but I imagine the majority of legislation written in Congress was written by businesses to
Yeah,
their own advantage.
right.
Supposed to be regulating them, and actually they're writing the
Yeah,
legislation specifically to meet their
yeah.
requirements. Yeah.
Well, Gabriel Kolko is another U.S. historian. He wrote a book called The Triumph of Conservatism, how the progressive era served the ruling class, and essentially, and with examples of that all along, that progressive era reform did bring about things like safety in meatpacking plants because of Sinclair Lewis,
Mhm.
but it ultimately got co-opted by those meatpacking companies because they were able to turn the regulations against the people who were going to compete against them because they had the ear of the legislator to do that,
Yeah.
which was a significant level of corruption. And so even the progressive era, which supposedly brought in many reforms that made things better, they figured out a way to co-opt it.
Yeah.
So it's an interesting world that we created with all of that, and there's but nonetheless, it did build an industrial base for America.
Yeah, I mean, again, if we're going to measure how well off we are by how much stuff we've got, it's never been better.
Mhm.
So a lot of people get the credit and some people get the blame, I guess. But I think we probably all have a sense of something's missing here in the midst
Mhm.
of all of this. So
Well, well, it remains to be seen what happens in this next period of time, in the
yeah,
next handful of years, and because we could be losing something very significant, and that's what worries me the most.
yeah, something in terms of what
Um, the democracy that we have,
we
and
don't
that
have a democracy.
yeah, well, we have a representative
Uh,
democracy,
no.
but but I still have a little bit of sway with my congressional representative,
Mhm.
and they are obliged to pay attention to me. And I write.
I'm a little more frustrated right here in Cincinnati, right here in this neighborhood. We can't get City Hall, which is I can see from here.
Yeah,
We
you
can't
can't
get.
get things done.
They just treat us
Well, they're in the
we are
hands of the
peons, and how dare we even waste their time talking to
they're
them?
in the
So,
hands of the developers at this point,
oh, are they ever? Yeah,
and
yeah.
that's a serious organizing job that needs to take place to
Mhm,
hold them accountable.
mhm.
But what I'm most fearful of is what will happen on the national level in terms of civil society and what could happen with the role of government in anything. And Cincinnati's city government is probably more responsive than most, but it
And
still is
that worries me
corrupt.
because if it's more responsive to most that's not responsive, what does that say about any place else? I don't know, but
Yeah. Well, it's difficult. It's
yeah,
difficult to pull off. But if
yeah.
you didn't have it, it could be a very ruthless world.
Well, I think if there's a if there's a spectrum, I think we're one of the wrong ends of the spectrum. Let's just put it
Mhm.
that way.
Yeah.
And,
So, well, we've had quite a conversation. We've covered only 500 years of history.
there you go. And I think we pretty much solved all the world's problems.
Yes,
So
we sure did.
you, me, and Toby. So, okay. Well, I appreciate your coming.
Oh, this has been fun.
Yeah.
I've enjoyed it a lot.
So
So,
have I.
how do you put this up? You got to edit it and then
Yeah, I try not to edit too much, but I put a, like
a bumper on
a
each front and
preface
back.
and a something at the back. I will come up with the name of that movie I couldn't think of, and I'll
Insert
get
it
it in.
in.
Yeah, but yeah, it'll go up. Well, you don't even know that necessarily. The site is Individualists Unite. Home base is Substack, so the platform is Substack. Individualists Unite.
Okay.
Yeah. But
Well, I'm on
if
Substack.
you put in conversations with real people, just to Google it,
Okay.
chances are it'll come up.
That'll
So,
good. Okay.
yeah.
So you'll put this up probably in the next week or so? 2 weeks?
Won't guarantee. It'll take me a little while to get everything together because I'll
Hmm.
break this up. How long have we gone here?
We've gone quite a bit.
What are we? Yeah, 2 hours. It seemed to go that long. I don't even look. We end up at 2 hours typically, somewhere around
It's
there.
been 2 hours. Yeah.
Yeah.
What time is it?
So
4 o'clock,
yeah,
4:17. We got
yeah,
started about
yeah,
2:15.
yeah. So yeah, I'll break this up into probably 4 segments. Try to keep it at half an hour
Oh,
each.
okay.
So yeah,
Well, that's good. Yeah, because it can be rather boring for someone to sit through
yep,
2 hours.
yeah, yeah.
Well,
So
this is fun. How many shifts have you done at Stowhouse?
more than I can count. I'm not sure.
Oh, that's good.
Yeah, it's fun. It's educational. You meet people.
I
Yeah,
I meet some wonderful people. I Last Thursday there were like 15 to 20 somewhere along that women from Indian Hill, which were part of a lunch crew that they started going to lunch with each other, and they after that they enjoyed each other's company enough so they do outings like
yeah,
this, and they all showed up at the Stowhouse,
good.
and it was a fascinating tour. I had so much fun.
Yeah.
Because they were all pretty well read and
Mhm,
so they had good questions
mhm,
and we had a lot of give and take. It was
yeah,
really a lot of fun.
good. Yeah, I like that when people know something of their own and they
Yeah.
can really contribute to it.
First part of April, I'm doing a
Mhm.
group of kids, high schoolers that are part of a coming of age class for their church
Mhm.
in Worcester, Ohio.
I went to school in Worcester, so yeah.
Oh, so you lived in Massachusetts and in Worcester.
Yeah, grew up in Massachusetts, spent most of my adult life in Ohio. Yeah.
Okay, okay. Well, this was a Unitarian church
Mhm.
in Worcester that they all the Unitarian churches have what's called a coming of age program for their
Mhm.
kids. It's where they introduce them to all the religions
Mhm.
of the world, and then they talk about what it means to be a Unitarian Universalist. And so they're on a trip, and they want to explore the connections between Unitarianism and Harriet Beecher Stowe.
Mhm.
So I was the person to ask since I'm a Unitarian, and
Yeah,
I could
yeah,
tell them what was going on and about Harriet's uncle and where they lived and things like that.
yeah,
So it's
yeah,
going to
good.
be fun.
Yeah,
But every time I go there, I just enjoy it immensely.
yeah, lots of good people.
Yeah.
So,
Well,
okay.
thank you for these
Oh,
too.
you're welcome.
This I I am enthralled with the
Mhm.
view and what this house represents. Who lived here before you?
There's a woman, it's in there. There's a woman named Mrs. Drack lived here for many decades. So she's kind of like the principal, and apparently her family built the house.
And this dining room is just. Have you ever filled all the seats?
Holidays with family. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
Yeah, I could see that this would be. Oh, this will be fun to look through this. And
Hmm.
so, did you do most of the
Pretty
renovation?
much all of it. Yeah.
Oh
Because
my God,
that's
is
what I did
this
for a living anyway.
that's the woman?
That's Mrs. Drack. Yeah. That would be, by the way, this book, since we're talking about it, Elysian Place, a family renovation, available on Amazon. So,
Oh, this is so good. And wow. Oh, look at that.
yeah, and then I worked on wood
Springfield
decorating.
Rolls Royce.
Yep, yep.
Wow. So, how long have you lived here?
40 something years here.
Oh, so you really have over those that many years done a lot of work.
Oh, yeah.
Do you do house restoration other places and stuff?
No, you can't get people to pay you to do that kind of work. So,
It's hard work.
speaking about markets and so forth,
It's a solid year of work
uh,
to get that done.
building new is easier than renovating by a lot. Easier
Yes.
and quicker. You'd think, oh, we're just going to patch some things up here. So
So did you try
uh,
to do it? in line with historic preservation stuff?
Well, at first I was going to restore it exactly as it had been. Um, and that was my mindset generally, but I kind of, my imagination got going and I wanted to,
Uh-huh.
what if I did this? And so I kept doing more
Right,
and more.
right, right.
So it's not a restoration, faithful restoration, but I've stayed sensitive to what the
Hmm.
house is.
Uh-huh.
So you don't see anything in here that couldn't have been done at the time.
Yeah.
So
Well, it's so ornate, this dining room. I love it. It's just great. Yeah, I wish our house had these kind of bones because it's just a really plain Jane farmhouse.
yeah, well, be thankful for what you've got. Maybe this house was a mess.
Uh-huh.
So yeah, it was a nice Victorian house, but boy, was it a mess.
Uh-huh.
So it was a lot to deal with.
Yeah. And it was built what year?
I can't find a date for sure, but 1880s sometime
Okay.
probably.
Well, it has that kind of feel to it.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah, late Victorian.
yeah.
Yep. Oh, this stuff around the dining room is amazing.
Mm.
Well, I got to get going,
Okay,
and such a pleasant time with
I
you.
would very
We
much so.
have,
Yeah, yeah.
and you were
And
such a
Toby,
wonderful guy.
he is. Once he gets to know you,
Yeah.
so,
Well, I look forward to looking at these things too.
sure.
I'm particularly intrigued by Cornelia.
And I want to hear what you have to say about it because
Okay.
you know these people as well as I do. So,
Yeah.
uh,
Yeah. Well, I remember seeing 12 Years a Slave,
yeah.
and I never read the book that Solomon wrote.
Well, I think the book is, they say the book is better. I think the book's not just better, but quite different than the movie. So,
Uh-huh.
so,
Yeah, I'm sure it is
so
that they had to. But this is the most distinguished picture of
yeah,
Albion.
yeah.
When you never would have guessed he only had one eye.
I didn't know that either. Well, we're
You'll,
going to just real quick say goodbye. So,
okay.
so
See you.
long. Thanks for coming.
Well, I really enjoyed that conversation with Tim. And again, we don't agree on everything because we have different perspectives, even when we look at exactly the same thing. Uh, but I learned some, and I hope that Tim did also. And of course, I hope you did. And by the way, that movie, which is well worth watching, is The Best Years of Our Lives, made, in the 1940s, maybe the 1950s. That's a special time after World War II. You want to talk about a state of flux when things were changing very rapidly, largely for the better, but boy, were lives disrupted. So check out The Best Years of Our Lives. I recommend it over just about anything that's coming out of Hollywood right now. Thanks for watching.